I just wanted to make, in a sense, a few obvious points and a few that sometimes get, I think, a bit lost in the discussions about measurement. And Stefan Durkon, Chief Economist at DFID, is going to really pick up a lot of these themes in a much more sophisticated way at the end, as he always does after I've said some rather simple things. The first is that from the perspective of almost everybody, getting measurement of what we do right is absolutely essential. It is clearly and most importantly essential so that we do the most effective things with the limited resources we've got for the poorest in society. That is the reason we're all here, and that's the reason we all do our jobs. So that is the most important reason. But there are also three other reasons. The second, which I think a lot of people in this room may not have to think about it all the time, but I certainly do in my job, people in NGOs do in their job, is to give assurance to the people who are giving the money that actually we're doing something useful. It is an astonishing thing for the rest of the world, actually, that the UK, in a time of great austerity, has a political consensus of all the major parties that the increase in development aid has gone up significantly, whilst all other budgets across the board have been cut. That's astonishing, but that does have to depend on us being able to demonstrate effects to the general public, to maintain that support and to justify it. And I've illustrated this with the fairly combative chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, who perfectly rightly would certainly take us to task if they felt we were wasting money when actually resources are extremely limited. Of course, we also need to do it to try and learn lessons from our own successes and also our own failures. Because all of us know that there are many things in development which in theory should work, but in practice don't. And learning from that is absolutely essential. And I think it is also important for us to keep our own humility, to stop us from kidding ourselves, to stop us from kidding politicians, that we're winning when we're not. I'm afraid that, and I'm not going to give lots of examples, you'll all be able to think of them, but there are many examples of everybody assuring one another that it's all going terribly well, when in fact it isn't. And I think we only need to look at where we've got to with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa at the moment, I think, to see how complacency is one of the biggest enemies of effective action. So that's the reasons why. But we are, of course, all prisoners of our intellectual pasts, and most people in tropical medicine come from either a clinical or a basic science background, or possibly from epidemiology or economics. And I think a few points are obvious and a few points sometimes get lost. The first, which is obvious in a sense, is that getting measurement to work is often not easy to do in a rigorous and transparent way that allows for meaningful comparisons between different sorts of intervention. So, for example, comparing a package of interventions which combine social interventions, for example, clinical interventions and diagnostic interventions, these kinds of things can often be quite difficult to assess meaningfully to work out what package is best. It's easiest when every step of the causal chain is measurable and there's no doubt about how you do it. So let us say bed nets. You can count bed nets, you can see whether they've got insecticide-treated things, you can see what proportion of people have them, you can see what proportion of people sleep under them, you can see what number of people have actually got malaria, you can see what number of people die. Every step along that way, you can test, we know stuff about all of that causal chain. Very few things in development are that simple. The great majority of the things we do have multiple steps, many of which we don't know how to measure, and therefore it's very difficult to assess what our impact is. So that being able to say with a clear conscience to Parliament, to donors, to an NGO, we know what's going to, you give us £50 and we can tell you what will happen, or you give us £1 million and we can tell you what will happen at the other end, is extremely difficult. Many important health interventions such as behaviour change, clearly absolutely key to the current Ebola outbreak, to HIV and many other areas, many of these things are more intangible than having malaria or not having malaria, dying from HIV or not dying from HIV. And this does clearly make things more difficult, and issues like governance, which we all know are critical, they undermine the way in which many of our interventions work. Measuring our impact on them is extremely difficult, and no one really has come up with a very good way of doing so. Commonly, however, we actually have situations where we probably could measure it, but no one has done the intellectual work to make it possible. Let's take a field different from medicine, so in a sense to make it not targeted at anyone in this audience particularly, education. Only in the last 5 years would I say that people have started looking seriously at what measures of proper outcome in education are. Education is not intrinsically more difficult than health, yet it simply has not happened. And there are many areas of health where that is true, where people simply have not, they've just said it's too difficult to measure and left it at that, rather than actually saying we've got to measure it, and now we're going to have to be imaginative about what we're doing. We're not going to be able to do it with classical epidemiological methods, with case control, cross-sectional and so on. We're going to have to develop new methodologies. And I think the final point, a political point, I don't mean that in a party sense, but a point for politicians, is there is always a risk in development that what gets measured gets done. We all know that, but the problem is that many of the things that are most important in development are quite difficult to measure. And I think we should always guard against the temptation only to do those things for which measurements exist, because if we do, we're going to leave huge areas of development, including big things like governance, completely untouched. And I think all of us have to help try and explain that to people, because I think there is a tendency for people simply to zero on the things where the measurement is possible. And that is a major error. Thank you very much.